for the most part, everything was at the trade centers. No one could ever envision. So there were backup antennas, but they were at the trade center. No one could envision that the physical structure would go away. The question was, what resources do we have available, and could it be a place to help essentially reestablish the over-the-air television signals?
September 11, 2001 is remembered for its profound human tragedy, but behind the scenes, it also presented an unthinkable challenge for broadcasters. How do you get back on the air when your transmitter site no longer exists? At the time, many of New York City's major TV and radio signals originated from the North Tower of the World Trade Center, which in an instant was gone. The result? A broadcast blackout for the estimated 20% of the region that wasn't connected to cable or satellite, and instead relied on over-the-air signals through rabbit ear antennas. Cable and satellite systems weren't spared either. Many providers depended on over-the-air signals from broadcasters rather than direct fiber connections. In the chaotic days after 9/11, some stations scrambled to restore temporary signals from the Empire State Building. But for the long-term solution, a new hub emerged, the Armstrong Tower in Alpine, New Jersey, the birthplace of FM radio. Join me as we explore the technical, logistical, and equipment challenges of getting New York's broadcasters back online after one of the darkest days in modern history. This is Inside the Broadcast, 9/12, back on the air.
I can't believe how strong this wind is.
We want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world.
And welcome inside the broadcast, everybody.
Hello, friends, and welcome to Inside the Broadcast's look at 9/12, back on the air. This is episode 3. Before we get to today's guest, Charles Sackermann, I wanted to take a moment to talk about the origins of this podcast. I consider myself to be an architecture and broadcast enthusiast. I love skyscrapers and tall buildings, and if you know me, I of course love my favorite Sears Tower. A few years ago, we were approaching the anniversary of 9/11. The 9/11 tragedies always hit me hard because it's the first national event I can remember. I was in 3rd grade at the time. So a few years ago, I started thinking, what happened when the North Tower of the World Trade Center, which many of New York City's broadcasters called home, all of a sudden was gone? I felt like it led to some sort of a scramble. I began to Google that, and I figured out that most of the broadcasters moved to Armstrong Tower in Alpine, New Jersey. I felt like this wasn't very well documented. There's a few articles about it here or there, but there's nothing where you can really hear people talk about it. I obviously have this series called Inside the Broadcast that's on my YouTube channel, but those episodes are nothing like this. I've never taken on anything like this where I've really had to interview people. So bear with me, or thanks for bearing with me to get to this 3rd episode of this series. I hope you've enjoyed what we've put together so far. Now on to our last episode where we interview Charles Sackermann. Armstrong Tower has been in the Sackermann family since the 1970s when Charles Sackermann Sr. purchased Armstrong Tower. The tower is maintained by his family and his son, Charles Sackermann Jr., who we'll speak to today. The tower had 3 main phases of operation following 9/11. Phase 1 was get service up and running. This would be getting broadcasters who had been taken off the air when the North Tower of the World Trade Center came down back on the air. Phase 2 was the interim phase. It was to increase power and raise antennas where it was possible to increase coverage. And then Phase 3, the last phase, was to upgrade the tower, its foundations, and electrical plant to accommodate high-power wideband antennas at the top of the tower to provide permanent long-term backup service. Now here's our conversation with Chuck Sackermann. He begins by telling us about his involvement with the tower.
I essentially started up there cutting the lawn, and carrying equipment up the tower, and I learned how to climb towers, and that was kind of my start. And then I ran, I guess, the operational side of things while I was in school. And then my father passed away in 1990, and at that point, I took over essentially our half of the business with a couple of my sisters that are also part of our family company. And yeah, we continued to develop the site and a number of other communication properties that the family owns. And kind of going forward from there, we were involved in, at least the phone rang during the first bombing of the Trade Center, and there were some questions around having Alpine as a backup, but nothing really materialized. But the morning of 9/11, obviously, all that changed. So, prior to 9/11, we had a very nice operation there in terms of the business that we did. A number of broadcasters had E&G antennas on the tower, so we had some microwave connecting us back into the city. We had some fiber, and then yeah, we pretty much had everything from, we still had some cable TV applications to a lot of government broadcast, and then the wireless services. There is a building, which is where we did the podcast from, the last podcast that we did, that has a museum that my father started, and it's a combination. We're working on acquiring more Armstrong era equipment, but it's basically the history of wireless as kind of things evolve through Alpine's role, or the tower's role, because we did kind of see the start and stop of a lot of different kinds of communications, everything from MCI to, as I said, all the paging companies, and it's really been, a blessing for me and my family to be involved in all those different aspects of communications over the years.
Well, that's quite interesting. I appreciate you explaining that. So obviously now the North Tower of the World Trade Center has gone down, which causes a logistical problem for every station involved. So I'm kind of curious if you can just take me through the immediate aftermath of that site and kind of just how things came to be in the post 9/11 world for Alpine Tower.
Sure, sure. So I along with everyone else, was glued to a TV sitting in my office. Our office is about 15 miles from the tower, and just watching things unfold. And I guess it was around 10:30, 11 o'clock that morning, my phone rang, and interesting irony, the first broadcaster to reach out to me was NBC, which, if you know the history of Armstrong, you understand why that's not, why that's interesting irony. First questions were just, we have to recover. We need somewhere to put our antennas. Everybody had backup equipment, and several of the stations were in the middle of either finishing or building their transition to digital. But for the most part, everything was at the trade centers. No one could ever envision. So there were backup antennas, but they were at the trade center. No one could envision that the physical structure would go away. So yeah, so the question was, what resources do we have available, and could it be a place to help essentially reestablish the over-the-air television signal? So and then I guess within a half hour to an hour of that, I heard from several other stations, and then it kind of just started to pick up speed in terms of what people were looking for, and just ideas on what we could accomplish, how soon could we accomplish it. So we my team went to the tower and met NBC there first. That was the kind of the start of it, and the idea was they had a small transmitter and a small antenna. The goal was just get that one antenna up and get a cable run and try to get that transmitter on the air. And then so at the time, back to your question, September 10th, the largest transmitter we had at the site was a 750 watt local university FM station that had been there for years. And now we were starting to have conversations about installing, 10 to 15 uh, 1,000 watt transmitters. And then in the case of WNJU, we're talking about dual 70,000 watt transmitters for UHF. So a lot of logistical challenges, obviously, to do that. We were fortunate in that we had room. We had a 6,900 square foot building at the base of the tower that we were able to. We did have room to accommodate the transmitters, but a lot needed to be put together to bring it all together from you know getting signals to the tower to feed the transmitters. So as I mentioned before, a few of the stations had a little bit of a leg up because we had existing E&G systems. So that helped. And then we did have some fiber, but the fiber needed to be extended. We kind of went into uh, the whole world was in an emergency at that point, and so were we. So it was pretty much 24-hour a day logistics at that point to just sit with the broadcasters and try to listen to what their requirements were, what they needed, what we could get done, how fast could we get it done, because the site itself was about, I guess it's about 15 miles north of where the trade center was, and it's quite a bit lower. The ground elevation at the site is 520 feet. The tower is 400 feet. So the top of the tower is about equal to the observation deck of the Empire State Building. So still very good height. No impediment around the site in terms of other buildings or anything, which was great. But we were further north, which definitely would affect their contours for transmitting, which is why eventually they moved back to Empire and then back now to the Freedom Tower. But yeah, so all of a sudden we were tasked with not only the logistical challenges of the equipment and which was just rotating. At one point, I think manufacturers, everybody was so cooperative. So we had equipment shipped to us from, all over the country. The broadcasters tried to identify transmitters that were close in frequency, that were basically either on the factory floor, or in some cases, I think they rerouted some that were already on their way to locations to be installed. So, at one point, I don't know, I think we had 10 tractor trailer, 40-foot tractor trailers parked out on 9W, which is the main road, with equipment and just trying to sort out because people had just started sending us stuff. And, it was now the job of kind of sifting through what we had and figuring out how to make it happen, and then how to make it happen in a few phases. So, the first goal was just get something on the air. And then it was, all right, step two is, all right, well, how do we get as close to replicating what they lost, and then planning for a longer term aftermath of this, because then people started to realize this was going to be a long-term project. So we started working with the 5 television stations and 1 FM that we were already working with that FM station, so that kind of moved them to the front. And as I said, a few of these broadcasters we had agreements with for other services, so that made it a little bit easier to work with them. But one of the first things we did on day one was back then everybody carried the nationwide pagers. So especially all the government agencies, everybody had those. This was, people had cell phones, but the pagers, the two-way pagers were still a big thing then. And one of the things that nobody realized was that the control transmitter for the nationwide paging was at the Trade Center. So all those paging services were out. So that was one of the first things we did, was get that reestablished, which then brought up paging in the metropolitan area, which was huge. And there were a few other government systems that were off the air that needed to be recovered. So that got taken care of, on 9/11. And then, basically we started focusing on the television stations after that. There were technology challenges. We're also now working with people who had just lost colleagues, right? Most of them had colleagues that were unfortunately lost during the trade center coming down. And at one point all these people were competitors, but now we're all in the same room, basically trading equipment to try to put together the parts and pieces needed to reestablish over-the-air television. And then on top of that, besides the broadcasting equipment, but now the largest transmitter was 750 watts. Now we're going to these huge broadcast transmitters. We don't have enough air conditioning. We don't have enough power. I think at one point we had installed 10 additional generators to run all this equipment. Yeah, as I mentioned, air conditioners came from everywhere because we didn't have anywhere near enough air conditioning. I would say at one point we had probably close to 100 people working round the clock between power, air conditioning, broadcast people, and then security. The site was manned with light security prior to 9/11. After 9/11, it was armed guards. We had off-duty state police there 24/7 for probably the next eight or 9 months, when everybody was kind of figuring out if there was what happened to the broadcasters intentional, or was it just a kind of something that came along with what was accomplished. So he didn't know if we would receive any additional attacks on any critical infrastructure. So that had to be put in place. Then we had to feed everybody. We had to find, we had to make sure we had bathroom facilities, and it turned into quite an operation.
I think it's worth noting you ticked off three of the things that I had on my list to ask just in that question. So I greatly appreciate that. I was certainly going to follow up about the power and cooling upgrades, because obviously when you have any sort of broadcast infrastructure, it needs to be cooled, and we're talking about high power transmitters. So I cannot even imagine the undertaking there. So speaking of that undertaking, the logistics of this site, I was speaking to Andy Bader, and he was saying that when you do things at the Empire State Building, it can be challenging based on where the Empire State Building is located. And another source was telling me that sometimes getting equipment to the top of the Empire State Building could be relatively difficult. So I would be curious from your end if you can just speak to kind of the unique location of Alpine Tower and how you think that helped facilitate some of the changes that were needed following 9/11.
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is that, the city was locked down for a number of days after, right? So you couldn't get anything in or out of the city. So I think that was may have ended up being a full week, but so that was one thing, is that helped quite a bit, being outside the city but being close enough that we had access to their engineers was a big plus. And then, yeah, the structure itself, in just the way it's configured, Major Edwin Armstrong built it for experimental FM TV, which just, by that definition, experimental, he is no telling all the different things that he had in mind. Television was, kind of in experimental phases at that point. So he certainly knew TV was coming. And I think that in his vision of the world, he liked the idea of having the broadcast facility outside of New York. And I'm sure that the pains that Andy described of operating and doing things on top of a building, although it's great to have the height and the inside room space, you're limited to dealing with logistical challenges of just getting equipment through the building that you don't have on a standalone structure. and the structure that is, the mission for it is to be a regional telecommunications facility.
I was speaking with Joe Mack, who worked for Gates Air, and he was explaining that many of the other clients, like Gray Television or Hearst, maybe were giving up some of the equipment that they had already purchased, basically putting that equipment to the front of the line for broadcasters that needed it because there was such a backlog of equipment following this event. I'm just sort of curious of, were you involved with working with any of the equipment manufacturers, or was that mostly left to the television stations?
It was mostly left to the television stations, but it was part of our daily. So for several months afterwards, we met pretty much on a daily basis, and then eventually on a weekly basis. So it was all, part of the discussion. And as I mentioned, we got low power equipment on the air as quick as possible, and then installed higher power equipment depending on the station and what their particular needs were. So yeah, and that's probably one of the biggest, things is that I remember from this is just the level of cooperation between the engineers, the stations, the vendors was just unbelievable. Everybody just, you know, understood how important it was psychologically to restore these services. And they just everyone was willing to do what needed to be done to make it happen.
I know that your family upkeeps the tower as a whole, but I'm curious if there were any structural upgrades that were needed all of a sudden with this extra equipment being on the tower.
So very, very good question, and that kind of leads to phase two and phase three. So yes, as I mentioned, the tower was built in 1937. At that time, I had already been involved in two structural upgrades of the tower. What we were looking at, there were several different variations of what could have happened there. We also needed to work with the municipality in terms of what was already approved and what needed to be approved to do additional things. They were very cooperative in the beginning, and then they had some local pressure that they became less cooperative as things went on, and further we got away from the event happening. So while we were kind of working through phase two, headed to phase three, but once the permanent antenna design was completed, then we went into a structural review and came up with a plan to accommodate the higher power antennas at the top of the tower, at least the majority of them. The VHF antennas were up at the top, and then the UHF antenna was side mounted at 380 feet. So we were able to do the 380 antenna pretty quickly, and the tower was able to accommodate it. The structural report noted that we were going to need to do some upgrades in order to accommodate the wideband VHFs at the top. So we basically went into a program at that point, which took about 3 years. First you have to establish the loads that are going to be installed. Then you have to go through and figure out, all right, well, when you install this, where are you going to be over? What members are going to be overstressed? And then you have to design for that. And then sometimes that design throws something else into into an overstress. So it was quite the process of working through. And at the same time, we were upgrading the whole power system. So as I mentioned before, we had 10 generators running at one point. Part of the long-term plan was to upgrade the power from the power company, install a new backup system and additional transfer switches. So while all that was happening, we were working on the tower upgrades as well. So once we had a design that everybody agreed to, and as part of that, again, we're working with the 1937 structure. The goal was to bring it up to the current building standards, which obviously things have changed quite a bit, especially from the tower standpoint, from 1937 to 2001. So We worked through the engineering process, and then contractors were selected. The original tower was stripped down to the original steel. All the upgrades, structural upgrades were completed, including the four foundations. It was determined that the foundations needed to be upgraded, so additional rock anchor bolts were installed, along with basically an integration system to tie to the existing system, and then new concrete piers were poured over the top of the new system. So we're fortunate we're on rock there, so your structural concern is not sinking; it's overturning moment from one leg to the other. So those legs were all upgraded and redesigned, and then the tower was repainted with galvanized paint, and then the high power antennas were reinstalled, and it was that took about 3 years until all that work was done.
That's fascinating. You know, a lot of the broadcasters would end up returning to Empire State Building and eventually One World Trade Center. When did things kind of start to calm down at Alpine?
I would say at least the first year was pretty crazy, and then it slowed down a little bit, but just between kind of the different phases, because we did the main tower work first, then we did the foundations, and then we installed the high power antennas. So it was pretty steady for that 3 year period. So while the broadcasters were moving back to Empire, there was a lot of coordination, and we were involved in some of that. And even when they went to primary at Empire, they would cut back to Alpine because they had to do work at Empire. And sometimes they were able to do that work at night, sometimes they weren't. So there was a lot of coordination between, if we could have, obviously we couldn't have their antennas transmitting on the tower during the day and have guys on the tower. So, we all worked very closely as all those different steps came together.
Obviously, you were alluding to the Sarnoff history with NBC. So I'm kind of curious if you would just take me through some brief history of the tower, with it kind of being the birthplace of FM, and just explain that to the people who will be listening to this.
It really goes back to the late 20s, early 30s. So Edwin Armstrong was, I think they call him the father of FM, but his contributions to wireless and to the world at large, go way beyond that in terms of his early inventions of, the super heterodyne receiver and some other things that are actually still used in every receiving circuit, including our cell phones. But in this particular case, he kind of had an on and off relationship with RCA, and RCA at that point was the precursor to NBC, and it was a company that was investing a lot of money in AM stations across the country. And interestingly enough, those AM stations were connected via landline phone lines. So there were a few things that Armstrong was looking at kind of for the future of broadcasting. One of them, David Sarnoff, the president of RCA, asked Armstrong if he could invent a black box that would take the static out of AM radio. Well, Armstrong comes back with FM radio. And, although none of us were there, it seems for a lot of reasons that FM coming out against Sarnoff's AM broadcast network would not have played very well for RCA and Sarnoff. So Sarnoff did everything he could to stop FM. And the first thing he did was that he basically evicted Armstrong from the test facility that Armstrong had at the Empire State Building. and Sarnoff said he needed that space for experimental TV. And that essentially forced Armstrong to come up with a plan to build, his own broadcasting facility. So, 1937, he goes out, finds a piece of land, and builds a facility from nothing, in Alpine, New Jersey. And, that becomes the first, commercial FM station. The tower itself was, he designed it, and he had American Bridge and Steel build it. It, he had but there's a block building there that housed his lab and his office, and the station, the programming station, and yeah, basically showed Sarnoff that FM was superior, and then started to build a number of other FM stations. One of the interesting things with the way that Armstrong did it was he could tie the stations together using FM, not having to have lease lines between the networks. So really building a standalone network, and that was called the Yankee Network. I think he had 4 or 5 stations between Alpine and Mount Washington that were part of this network. Well, at this point, the patent wars are starting to really heat up between Armstrong and RCA and several of the other companies that, Armstrong turned all his inventions over to the government to help win World War II. And unfortunately, when the war ended, a lot of people continued to build transmitters or receivers on Armstrong's technology without paying him any rights, which just, should not have happened. And it cost him, his relationships with his family, because he went into, year after year long patent lawsuits. So one of the other things that Sarnoff did to basically quash or hold back FM was he got the FCC to change the frequencies and moved FM to where the current FM band is, and give the original FM experimental band to television, which, essentially knocked out Armstrong's FM network that he was starting. So there was a lot of irony to NBC needing Armstrong to get back on the air in New York after all those years.
Lastly, to the thing everyone's probably wondering about, why is the tower shaped that way?
Yeah, great question. Well, because it was for experimental, for antenna separation. So those arms are 75 feet on either side. So it's 150 feet across end to end. And he had his antennas on masts between the arms, and that allowed him to do, again, that was his test bed. This had never been done before. There was a machine shop in one of the buildings at the base of the tower, where he would make his antennas. Because there wasn't anybody to call up and order anything from. He was it. He had to think about it, make it, build it, or it didn't exist.
So to our listeners, I did make a bit of a recording error, but there's an answer in here that I definitely want to include, so it might sound a little bit different. Charles Sackermann had this to say about how Armstrong Tower, and really everyone in the broadcast community, handled the post 9/11 situation.
I owe everything to Armstrong. My family, as I mentioned, has been blessed in being to be able to be in the communication business, and the things that I've learned, directly from being there, but then from the people that I've met and just the life experiences. Andy's a phenomenal person. It was a great experience, and that's really the thing. The people part of this, as I sat to kind of think about this ahead of this conversation, is the part that, you always say with companies, and equipment, we can get to 99%, but it's that, it's still the people that make the difference, and, all those broadcasters should be proud of the people that were representing them, because it's amazing what was accomplished. I'm certainly proud of my team because it all kind of happened in front of us, and you meet the challenges that come in front of you.
My biggest thanks to Charles Sackermann for taking the time to sit down with me for this interview. Just got into so many details, not only about broadcasting, but actual engineering of the tower, and I really appreciate it, and I don't know where else you'd find that. This concludes our series 912 Back on the Air. It's been such a privilege to bring you these accounts. This show is made possible with the help of Tom May, Dave Dubiel, Howard Fine, and Harold Borth. Special thanks to Tom Ray, who through many phone calls connected me with industry professionals, and Rich Pileski, who gave me a better understanding of how transmitter sites work. He also got me in contact with some key people for this series. Lastly, a thanks to the interviewees, Andy Bader, Joe Mack, and Chuck Sackermann, all who were so willing to give time out of their days to chat about a difficult subject. And of course, thanks to you for listening. This series was dedicated to Rod Coppola, Don DeFranco, Steve Jacobson, Robert Pattison, Isaias Rivera, and Bill Steckman. All were broadcast engineers who lost their lives at the World Trade Center on 9/11. May they rest in peace, and may their memories be a blessing.